Well, good evening. How are you all tonight? Very good. I wish you could get some of you to come to church because you guys are sitting in the front. Everybody else sits in the back. So anyway. Well, we're blessed to have you all here. Just a couple of housekeeping things to get started. If you need the restroom, you go through the double doors in the back, make a left at the bottom of the ramp. The restrooms will be right in front of you. Most of you came in the side door, so you didn't see that there's some watermelon and cupcakes and water back there. Help yourself if you'd like some of those. If you worked out today and can take the sugar, you're ready to go. So we're really blessed to have Kevin with us. He is a very interesting man. I've heard him speak a couple of times, and always interested in the history of our country. We do live in the greatest country ever. I believe that. I believe that our founding fathers were godly men who heard from God when they were forming our founding documents, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about what Mr. Kevin has to say. And he doubles as our state representative, and he's doing some great things up there too. So I'm going to pray, and after that, I'll turn you over to Mr. Ritter. So, Father, thank you for this wonderful opportunity that we have tonight to be together and to study and to learn about our founding documents. We just ask, Father, we pray blessings on the United States of America. Lord, we have wounds and divisions, things that need healed, but your word says, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and turn from their wicked ways, I will hear from heaven and heal their land. So, Father, we believe that you are not done with the United States, and you have great and mighty things ahead for us. And Lord, just pray blessing on Kevin as he speaks. Open our hearts that we might receive. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Mr. Kevin, it's all yours,
Thanks.
Sir. Give him a hand.
There's a lot of stuff up here.
Yeah, feel free to play wherever you want.
Well, Gordy's taking care of the housekeeping, but I'm going to ask you if you would give him one more round of applause for opening this place up. When we thought about doing this series, we thought about what's a natural place. And because God has so blessed our nation, we thought it was appropriate to do it in a church. So we appreciate Gordy making his available. Before I get into things this evening, there are a couple things I want to tell you. This series is a 4-part series. It's going to be this week and then the next 3 Thursdays. We're going to meet at 7 o'clock, same place, same channel. We'll cover different topics each evening, but this is part of our local America 250 series. America 250 groups have popped up literally all over the country. We have one at the statewide level that does a number of things, but we also have one here locally. If you folks are interested at all in the events that they've got going on, let me know, and I can put you in touch with the folks that are organizing those. In terms of my background, I know many of you in the room, but for those who I don't, I am your state representative, but this is not a political evening. My background is teaching, and I spent the better part of 25 years teaching mostly at the college level, some at the high school level. Didn't really get to teach what I studied, which was European history, but rather I taught American history, I taught ancient history, and I taught American government. So being up here standing in front of you good folks is very comfortable. I miss doing this very, very much. And as I was preparing for this evening, I was thinking back to the bicentennial. How many in here remember the bicentennial? Your daughter didn't put her hand up in the back, Rodney. During the year of the bicentennial, I was 9 years old, and I remember we had somebody come into our elementary school, and they told us stories about the founders. And I was so taken with that I went home and asked my mother if she would help me write a letter to the President of the United States, to President Ford. And she did that. And I thought it was a pretty good letter. I sent it off to President Ford, and what I suggested to him is for the bicentennial, every state should be represented by a different speedboat and we should have a national speedboat race. Surprisingly, the funding did not come through for that project, but I got a very nice letter back from the president. Those of you that remember the bicentennial, you remember the excitement, right? You remember people painting the fire hydrants and having parades and celebrations and music shows and things like that. I'm hopeful that as we get closer to July the 4th, we're going to see much the same, because it's very important that we remember the founding of our country. I'm going to finish this evening with a story about a gentleman by the name of Abraham Clark. I mention his name now because I was asked in the statewide 250 meeting last week, what's so great about 250? Why should we remember this? And I told the story of Abraham Clark. He was one of the 56 signers to the Declaration. So I'm not going to tell you that story now, but I think you'll get it when we finish our evening together. What I want to do for a brief moment is give you a little bit of a taste of what's ahead. There are 3 topics that we're going to cover this evening. If you've seen any of the flyers for this event, you might already know these. This evening, I'm going to talk about the origins of American government. So we're going to reach back into ancient history. We're going to look at the Hebrews. We're going to look at the Greeks. And we're going to look at the Romans. Because each of those 3 peoples contributed something to our American government. When we finish that, we're going to talk about British colonial America. What was it like for the American colonists living under British rule? And then lastly, the last third of our time together, I'm going to talk about the Declaration of Independence. That will get us through this evening. The talk about the Declaration this evening, I'm going to focus on the history. How was the document created? By whom was it created? When we gather next week, I'm going to start with the Declaration again, but I'm going to tell a different story. We're going to look at the Declaration as a literary document, written mostly by Thomas Jefferson, but it's one of the greatest literary documents in Western civilization, and we don't think about it that way. So we're going to start with that next time. And then we'll talk about the Articles of Confederation, our first system of government that only lasted about a decade. We remember it as a failure, but there were positives about it. We're going to talk about the U.S. Constitution, and then we're going to talk about the Bill of Rights. So that will take us through next week. In our third week together, we're going to answer the question, what can the states do when the federal government acts beyond the boundaries we've set for it? There is a solution to that. It's called nullification or interposition. So we'll talk about that. We're also going to talk about the Northwest Ordinance, the document by which this part of the country was created and set up. And we're going to finish our third meeting together by talking about the Federalist era. Those are the first 3 presidencies, 2 by Washington, 1 by John Adams, the first 12 years of our country. That's the foundation that was set. And then our last evening together, we're going to talk about the 2 terms of Thomas Jefferson, 1800 to 1808. Very, very different presidency, very different feel to that America than there was to the Federalist America. And the last thing we'll talk about that evening, I hope, is something that will be fun for you. It is for me. It's entitled The Revolutionary Evolutionary American Language. As we separated from Great Britain, our languages separated as well. And I think it's interesting to look through the American founding through that language. So that's where we're headed over our 4 weeks together. I would tell you folks, if you enjoy this evening, if you would reach out to a friend, share the flyer with them, bring somebody else along. We would love to have other folks that join us along the way. They don't have to have heard this evening for the next evening to make sense. All right, let's get started. Whenever I begin a course in American history or American government, we begin with the question, why government? Why is government necessary? James Madison answered that question in Federalist number 51 when he said, but what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. Throughout history, civilized societies have seen a need for government because order is the first need of all. Without order, none of our other rights are even possible. Therefore, the primary responsibility of government is to establish order. And governments can do this in a number of different ways. Democratic governments establish order based upon the consent of the governed. Monarchies rely on the authority granted by God to a single monarch or to an established order. Totalitarian governments often use the threat of violence against the people, as a means to establish order. In the United States, we have a republican form of government. The citizens of our great country give authority to the government to perform certain explicit functions. Likewise, there are certain rights granted by God that are protected from a majority for all citizens. Our Constitution was established with the understanding that men are in fact not angels, and those in government may not always seek to serve the public. They might seek instead to serve themselves. As such, we have built into our system certain checks and balances meant to keep any one branch of government from becoming too powerful. Ours is also a federal system, which means the states share power with the federal government, and those states are sometimes meant to check the power of that federal government if it grows too great. What I want to begin, or what I want to look at the beginning of our class here, is what are the origins of what we think of as American government. Over the next 60 to 70 minutes, I want to look back into history to try to determine what are the ideas that we associate with our American system and where did they have their origin. In doing so, we're going to consider the influence of some of the great societies of the ancient world. These are the Hebrews, the Greeks, and the Romans. Let's look first at the Hebrews. The ancient Hebrews understood the human condition as it had never been understood before. The Hebrews believed more than any society before them that an all-powerful intelligence or spirit, God, watched over them. They believed that God gave them a moral or a human nature, and that nature had been corrupted in the fall of Adam and Eve. They further believed that because of this fall, all humans have a tendency to sin, that men will tend toward evil rather than good. We call this concupiscence. As a result, government is not only necessary, it's ordained and blessed by God. There are numerous biblical references to this effect. I'll just mention two. Romans 13, 1 through 7. We find, let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. In 1 Peter 2, 13 and 14, be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do wrong and praise those who do right. Keep in mind that it's also the Hebrews who gave us the notion of natural law, or law given by God directly to man. Think of the story of Moses and the Ten Commandments. The reason God gave these laws to Moses was that Jewish society had become disordered and people were suffering. So we also get from the Hebrews the idea that certain laws are ordained by God rather than simply created by man. Think of the difference between a foundational law given by God, something like thou shalt not steal, and a more mundane law created by man, like a speed limit. Let me make the further observation that while God's laws are unchangeable, man's laws can be altered by any new majority or by the whim of any ruler. In conclusion, the ancient Hebrews were responsible for giving us the notion of moral order. This is essential because our system of government is based upon the idea that individuals seeking to please God will also seek to be virtuous. This assumption has allowed us to set up an entirely new system of government, one that focuses on limiting the actions of government rather than the actions of the individual. Unlike most other systems in the world, the American government does not tell subjects what they can do. American citizens tell the government what it's allowed to do, or at least that's how it's supposed to work. When this system breaks down is when individuals stop pursuing virtue and they pursue their own narrow interests instead. Many of you might be familiar with John Adams' quote. He said, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the governance of any other." Now, the Greeks were also contributors in a very different way from the Hebrews. The Greeks may seem an odd choice as far as a society that influenced our current system of government because they never learned to live together in peace and justice. Greek city-states were always at war, and individual rights were defended usually by armies rather than ideas. What the American founders found useful in the Greek experience was that it served as a cautionary tale, a tale of class conflict, disunity, violence, private and public arrogance, and of civic collapse. In other words, Greece gave the founders an example of what not to do. Despite that, it's true that Western civilization could not have come into existence without the Greeks. Either in spite of, or maybe because of, their constant infighting, the Greeks identified one of the greatest threats to good government, the vice of hubris. Defined as overweening arrogance, we have many examples of bad Greek government that came as a result of this very human vice. The Greeks failed to achieve freedom and justice largely due to the weakness of Greek religion. Rather than existing as universal notions as they did in Hebrew culture, freedom and justice were seen merely as relative terms in the Greek world. These concepts varied considerably in strength, depending upon the city-state in question. Still, the Greeks sought both. The best example for the American founders was a man named Solon, a 6th century BC reformer who sought to bring freedom and justice to the city-state of Athens. The political and intellectual leaders of the young United States would further profit from the tragic example of disunity provided by the Peloponnesian War. After this disastrous war between Athens and Sparta, the Greek philosopher Plato dedicated himself to determining how best to recover order. Remember, order is the first need of all. Plato taught that there exist divine moral laws and that God, not man, is the measure of all things. He believed strongly that you can only bring order to society by first bringing order to men's individual souls. In the end, there were very few positive examples the founders took from Greek history. First, Solon's notion of mixed government, as well as checks and balances, both appear in our own Constitution. Second, Aristotle's teachings influenced the founders on the importance of community. A man in solitude must be either a beast or a god, said Aristotle. It is only in community that human beings realize their aim in existence. They become fully human only when they become part of a community. Third, Plato taught the Western world the importance of the common good or justice. In the words of Russell Kirk, Plato reminded men that there endures a realm of ideas more real than appetite. He affirmed that the unexplained life is not worth living. And he insisted that if men's souls are disordered, society becomes no better than a cave or a dust storm. Many of these very ideas will be echoed by the founders in the 18th century. Finally, the Romans. The Romans' greatest contribution to the American understanding of good government is their respect and reverence for the rule of law. This is the notion that all are subject to the law, and that the law is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. This is the notion that began with the Assyrian king, Hammurabi, when he first posted his laws, known as Hammurabi's Code, for all the citizens to see. By posting these laws publicly, his subjects were made to understand that the laws applied not only to them, but to the rulers equally and without prejudice. A second Roman influence on the American system of government is the notion of public virtue. Worth as a Roman citizen was determined by the extent that you lived out the so-called manly Roman virtues. There was a level of discipline and incorruptibility in this Roman system. A third influence of the Romans is their system of checks and balances and of mixed government. The great chronicler of Roman government, a Greek slave by the name of Polybius, believed the Romans had created the perfect government with a mixture of the monarchical, the aristocratic, and the democratic. The Roman institutions of checks and balances in politics and the separation of powers would be imitated in the structure of government created in the United States. A fourth influence of the Romans on our system is their adherence to a notion of ordered liberty. A Roman citizen could only be considered free if he practiced the virtue of pietas. This meant that he fulfilled his duties, both religious and social. He subordinated his own desires to the claims of others. And finally, a pious man believed it better to die for his country than to fail in his sacred duty to Rome. Hopefully you're hearing themes that are very familiar to you in the founding of this country. A Roman by the name of Marcus Tullius Cicero was the spokesman for the sort of ordered liberty the American founders were seeking. The study of Cicero lay at the heart of American education from the time of our nation's founding through the 19th century. In a corrupt time, Cicero was incorruptible. So as a model of Republican virtue, he became an example for the founders. The founders took to heart Cicero's most famous teaching, that it was impossible to do good through evil means. They echoed Cicero's teaching that supreme law comes from God, and that the law of the state is valid only to the extent that it's in harmony with natural law or God's law. The Romans influenced the American system of government in a fifth way as well, through the practice of the philosophy called Stoicism. Romans learned that God directs all things and is everywhere present. They further learned that it's man's duty to understand the will of God and to seek to live it out. Stoics were taught to look upon men, good and bad, as his brothers, and they were taught to seek the well-being of all mankind. Because of these teachings, Stoicism has been described by historians as the front porch to Christianity, the precursor to what Christ would teach. The final influence of the Romans on the Americans is a negative influence, much like the Greeks. Through the Roman example, the founders learned that the greatest threat to good government is the consolidation of power in one individual or in one branch of government. By the time the Emperor Diocletian rose to power in the 3rd century A.D., the whole imperial structure was grossly over-centralized. In order to summon the authority needed to rule, Diocletian sided with the impoverished populace against the leading citizens of Rome. This system of warfare tore the empire apart and eventually led to its collapse. So there have been a variety of other influences on the American form of government, but most historians would agree the American system is primarily a product of what the founders learned from the ancient Hebrews, Greeks, and Romans. Forgotten today, the last signer of the Declaration of Independence to die was a man by the name of Charles Carroll of Carrollton. Held in high esteem by his colleagues, both for his rhetorical skill and for his steady virtue, he was known as the American Cicero. This nickname is just one indication that the founders fully understood the debt they owed to the ancients in crafting the longest-lasting Republican government in the history of the world. So our government certainly has roots, and those roots go all the way back to the ancient world. What I want to switch our focus to now is British colonial America. What was it like for folks living under British rule, as they did here for quite some time? By the middle of the 18th century, the American colonies represented a very small part of the vast British Empire. Their size betrayed their importance, however, as they retained the potential for fabulous growth. Despite the important place the American colonies held in the British Empire, the residents of those colonies were made to feel inferior to their counterparts in other parts of the empire, due to a slow overhaul of imperial law. The new policies convinced the American colonists that England did not see them as citizens with full rights, but rather as subjects with limited rights. By seeking to force the colonies to depend on Mother England for most of their needs, the king bred resistance to his rule. The growing dislike for England led to an internal unity among the colonies and the further development of an independent attitude, independent from Mother England. We don't need London, we can do this on our own, was what people thought. As the colonists moved further from their English counterparts, both socially and intellectually, a certain American outlook began to emerge. The great French observer of American culture, Alexis de Tocqueville, would highlight some of these distinguishing characteristics when he visited the U.S. in the 1830s. We're jumping ahead to de Tocqueville because he is such a prescient observer of the American system. But I want to tell you just a couple things about Tocqueville before I tell you about his observations. Tocqueville was one of the wealthiest men in France in the 1830s. He was a member of the aristocracy. He was interested in making his way in the world, making a name for himself. But he also had a question that kept him up at night. And that was, how did this new nation across the Atlantic, how did the United States catch up to France so quickly? In our economic output, in our energy, in our politics, our foreign policy. How did the United States catch France that quickly? That's the question that Tocqueville is seeking to answer when he comes to the United States. And he spent 9 months traveling all over the country. Let me share with you some of his observations. The first thing Tocqueville noticed when he came to the United States was there was great social mobility. People were constantly rising and falling. This wasn't possible in Europe because of the long-standing traditions regarding social rank, privilege, and wealth. In Europe, one was born into a certain social standing, and that's where you stayed. In the U.S., for the most part, each individual earned his or her place through their own initiative. Second, his second observation, there was a proliferation of educational opportunities that he found in the United States. Unlike in Europe, where education was reserved just for the aristocracy, the American colonies had dozens of colleges and other schools, making education available to all males who could attend. Unlike in Europe, where universities were typically run by the state, the American schools and universities were founded by religious orders and were largely private in nature. Despite the fact that students studied all of the liberal arts, over 25% of the graduates in British America, or in America at the time Tocqueville is here, over 25% of the graduates went on to become ministers, the most honored of professions. Third, because of the social instability present in the American colonies, no single class played the role of patron of the arts. This is one of the negatives that Tocqueville saw. In Europe, the great aristocratic families were the patrons of the arts, supporting them on a massive scale. Because there was no aristocracy to perform a similar function in America, American art tended to be inferior to that of Europe. Because they couldn't count on earning a living from wealthy patrons, American artists had to produce things they could sell if they wanted to eat. In the colonial period, this meant the content of their art was largely limited to patriotic scenes and to portraiture. Literature was similarly limited. A fourth observation of Tocqueville's was that a kind of American vernacular, a kind of American language, began to grow up among those who had been born in the colonies. Colonists prided themselves on innovative spellings and stripping what they called the excess baggage off English words. This new brand of English was so different by the time of the American Revolution that Noah Webster began to work on a dictionary of specifically American English. Tocqueville's fifth observation was this. He also noticed the Americans had a passion for politics. In a system where the individual had agency, they could affect the world around them, people sought to become involved. They not only saw this involvement as an opportunity to improve life in general, but they also saw it as the duty of all good citizens. Finally, Tocqueville noticed that Americans had a passion for the written word. They were constantly reading. Though many Americans didn't have the money to purchase expensive books, they did purchase and read pamphlets and newspapers at a rate far exceeding our modern reading habits. Tocqueville commented on the fact that even the working class seemed to be well read. To paraphrase, he said, "I can go into any field and speak with the farmer about Cicero." How very different from today. Let's look for a minute at common life in British America. So we'll go back to the time of the Revolution and before. Before the Revolution, agriculture was the leading industry in the colonies, employing about 90% of inhabitants. Of course, there was shipbuilding and commercial fishing industries. There was a lumbering industry, a textile industry, but these were in limited parts of the country. Still, most people worked the land. Especially profitable for some in the shipping business at the time was what was known as the triangular trade. A ship captain would set sail from the American colonies with a cargo of rum. He would sell that rum in Africa in exchange for slaves. He would then take those slaves to the West Indies and sell them in return for molasses. He would take the molasses to New England, where it would be distilled into rum, and the process would begin again. On each leg of the trip, the captain would make enormous profits. Daily life for colonists in British America was unique as well. Daily life for those colonists was very Spartan, to say the least. Most colonists lived in one-room farmhouses, heated with a central stove. Their few clothes hung on pegs on the wall, and there were few furnishings in the house. What was typically known as father's chair, that was the only one that had arms on it, was often the only genuine chair in the home, the rest being stools and benches. The closer to the frontier one lived, the more one could see the effects of what was known as Indianization, the influence of Native American culture on the colonists. Where there had been frequent contact with Indians, one could expect the colonists to smoke tobacco and grow crops like squash and corn. Like the Indians, the colonists would eat dried venison, wild rice, and potatoes. Colonists copied Indians by traveling via snowshoe and dugout canoes. They also, out of necessity, learned to fight like the Indians. How about religion? While there were a number of Protestant denominations, Maryland, of course, was the only Catholic colony. While there were a number of Protestant denominations in the American colonies, the two predominant churches were the Anglican, or the Church of England, and the Congregational, or Puritan Church. British officials sought to impose the Anglican faith on the colonies as a way of keeping them British, but they were largely unsuccessful. The Americanized Anglican faith, later to become known as the Episcopal Church, was more moderate than its British counterpart. In the words of one historian in America, sermons were shorter, hell was less scorching, and amusements like fox hunting and dancing were less scorned. The Congregational Church maintained its fire and brimstone character, which was very popular in the northeastern colonies. While Catholics were discriminated against in both law and practice, in general, America was far more tolerant religiously than was Europe. This free market of religious thought benefited Americans in that religious practice was typically varied, unregulated, and enthusiastic. In keeping with this atmosphere, American preachers displayed a thoroughly anti-intellectual bent in which fiery sermons replaced written lectures. I'm talking to you, Gordy. In the 1740s, a formerly religious culture became an obsessively religious culture under the influence of two specific preachers, those being George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards. The upsurge in religiosity that flooded the American colonies in the 1730s and 40s was known as the First Great Awakening. It's worth noting that many historians credit this movement with laying the groundwork for the American Revolution. George Whitefield was born in England and came to the American colonies in 1741, so 35 years before the Revolution. He traveled the countryside where he regularly attracted crowds in the thousands. In a day before microphones, Whitefield had developed his voice to such a point that he could be clearly heard by large crowds without any kind of enhancement. He probably would have mocked me for wearing this head device in here. Benjamin Franklin once heard that Whitefield addressed a crowd of nearly 30,000 people. Incredulous, Franklin set out to prove this account a lie. He calculated the amount of land needed to accommodate a crowd of this size, and then he walked a circle around where Whitefield was purported to have stood, all the time maintaining vocal contact with his assistant. In the end, Franklin pronounced the account true and said that Whitefield could have been heard by an even larger crowd because of his exceptional delivery. Whitefield's dramatic preaching style both thrilled and frightened his listeners. He acted out biblical stories on stage, playing each of the major parts himself. His impersonation of Satan and descriptions of hell terrified his audiences. We actually have accounts of folks screaming and running off into the woods. They were so terrified by George Whitefield. In contrast to Whitefield, Jonathan Edwards' preaching style was learned and closely reasoned. Tall, delicate, and intellectual was Edwards. A native of Massachusetts, he sought to persuade sinners to return to God by painting a vivid picture of hell. Sinners in the hands of an angry God was his most famous sermon. Edwards and Whitefield both often brought listeners to tears with their sermons, which always concluded with a call to salvation, an altar call. Parishioners were encouraged to come forward, confess their sins, and begin their lives anew in service to God. The First Great Awakening began to fade by the end of the 1740s, but it had left several indelible marks on the American colonial landscape. First, it divided colonial clergymen into what were known as the Old Lights and the New Lights. The Old Lights were those preachers who were highly skeptical of the emotionalism and theatrical elements of Whitefield and Edwards' styles. The New Lights, on the other hand, defended the style. They defended it as essential to the revitalization of religion in the colonies. The New Baptist denomination saw many new adherents as they were especially willing to accept the new emotionalism in religion. This break led to many schisms in the American churches that we still see today. The second major impact of the Great Awakening was the effect it had on American clergy, who became less intellectual and more pragmatic. In other words, they were more concerned with saving souls than with teaching doctrine. Thirdly, this religious revival laid the groundwork for a similar movement, the Second Great Awakening, that would sweep American society in the early 19th century and make it possible for the eventual abolition of slavery. Let's talk about education. We said a few words earlier about education in the colonies, and I think we should make a few more distinctions about this subject before we leave it, because it's indicative of the uniqueness of American culture. The British saw the purpose of education as creating leaders from among the top class in society. By contrast, the American colonists believed education should be open to all. The American interest in education for all had its beginnings in religion. It was a desire for boys and men to know how to read so they could study the Bible. Because the Congregationalists were the most Bible-centered of the denominations, it makes sense that they were the first to open primary and secondary schools in Massachusetts. Colonial schools were a mix of both public and private. The children of the wealthy colonists were still taught in the home by private tutors, but the subjects were largely the same: Greek and Latin and the classics. Colonial educators believed this sort of classical learning, by focusing on the lives of the great figures in history, would enable students to best emulate the virtues they saw in their heroes and their heroines. The organizing principle of the school was that the teacher was the expert, and it was the duty of the interested student to learn certain facts so as to provide him or her with the basis for future learning. Discipline in the colonial schools, as you can imagine, could be severe, with expectations for learning that went far beyond what they are now. One of the things that Alexis de Tocqueville quickly noticed when he traveled to America is that he was just as likely to see a poor sharecropper engaged in reading as he was to see a wealthy plantation owner. In Tocqueville's eyes, Americans were unique, again, because they all loved to read. The vast majority of Americans in the 18th century, we said, were too poor to buy books, so they read pamphlets and leaflets and journals, all things that could be produced cheaply. They also read newspapers at a much higher rate than did Europeans. Benjamin Franklin observed this fact early in his life, and he built a fortune selling reading materials to eager readers. In fact, he created the first postal service in America so that his reading materials could be delivered throughout the colonies. His most famous production, however, was Poor Richard's Almanac, which he produced from 1732 through 1758. Newspapers proved to be a very powerful political tool, used by all sides to air their grievances and later to rally support for the revolutionary cause. Still, the favorite pastime of American colonists was politics. While their charters differed significantly, most colonies had a similar legislative system with an upper house and a lower house. The upper house was typically selected either by the king or by the proprietor. The lower house was chosen by the people of the colony. In most colonies, the people voted directly on taxation, and those taxes were paid directly to the colonial legislature. Keep that in mind. That's going to be very important here in a moment. Local government differed based upon the region of the country in which you were traveling. In the southern colonies, county government was the rule. In the northern colonies, decisions were made by town councils and by other groups. In both cases, the American colonists had an unprecedented amount of power over how they were governed. Still, there were limits to participation. Voting was limited typically to males who owned land and paid taxes. There were also religious tests that prohibited some candidates from running for office. All in all, the American colonists enjoyed far more say in his political system than did the average European at the same time. Now, we're going to transition to the final part of our evening together and talk about the Declaration, but in order to do so, we need to skip over something, and I want to acknowledge that. What we're going to skip over is the British effort to defend their colonies against the French threat. That is basically known as the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War. It runs from 1756 through 1763. A lot of action in this part of the country during the 7 Years' War. Suffice it to say, the British were successful in defending their colonies, but the debt that they ran up in doing so would be very important as we consider the colony's effort to break with England. So let's finish with the Declaration. And again, I told you we're going to talk about the history of the Declaration tonight. We'll look at the document itself next time. The story of the Declaration of Independence begins in the year 1760. 1760 is important because that's the year that George III comes to the throne of England. Just 22 years old at the time, he was third in a line of kings known as the Hanoverian dynasty. The Hanoverians are a bit of an odd case in British history since they weren't British at all. They were German. George III's great-grandfather, George I, was invited by the British Parliament to sit on the British throne after the childless Queen Anne died in 1708. He was the nearest relative. Neither George I nor George II spoke English, and both took a very hands-off approach as a result to running the British Empire. Took a very hands-off approach, especially with the American colonies. As a result, during the reign of George I and George II, the power of the monarchy diminished, while the power of Parliament increased. Even though he was a Hanoverian, George III was very different from his grandfather and father before him. Those of you that are listening closely may say, what happened to his father? His father was never actually king. He died of throat cancer before he could take the throne. George III, again, was very different from his predecessors. He was British in his thinking. He was British in his upbringing, in his schooling. George III spoke English as his first language. And most importantly, he was determined to reverse the relationship between king and parliament. This mindset of the young king led almost immediately to conflict between the crown and his American colonies. The second issue also contributed to the growing tension between England and her colonies. That issue was the king's insistence that the colonies pay the bulk of the cost of the 7 Years' War. I said that'd be important a few moments ago. Since this war was largely fought in North America, the king insisted that the colonists pay for it. To this end, he sought to tax them directly, an unprecedented move. Colonists had always paid taxes. They'd paid taxes for over 150 years, but they paid those taxes to their colonial legislatures, not to a king in a far-off capital. This is when we begin to hear cries of taxation without representation. The American colonists said it was immoral to tax them without actual or direct representation in Parliament. They pointed out that no member of that body actually represented them directly. King George replied that the colonies were in fact represented through what was known as virtual representation. The idea that every member of Parliament concerned themselves not only with their district, but with the whole of the British Empire. So the king said, you have representation. There's no doubt the years from 1760 to 1775 were a period of great change and struggle between the colonists, who were determined to assert their rights as Englishmen, and their king, who saw them as second-class citizens. John Adams said that it was during this decade and a half that the real American Revolution took place. It took place in the minds of the colonists before even a drop of blood was shed on Lexington Green. The change that Adams and others like Thomas Paine saw taking place before their eyes was a shift by the colonists away from claiming rights according to tradition and historical precedent. These are the foundations of British common law, and in the direction of claiming rights based upon nature itself. Adams argued that just as there are physical laws of nature, there are also moral laws that provide a surer foundation for liberty than the British example. During the decade and a half leading up to the Revolutionary War, American founders set about discovering and highlighting these moral laws as the foundation for an even more perfect union. The thing that is important to keep in mind is that in the late 18th century, Great Britain was the most liberty-loving empire in the history of the world. The fact that the American colonists were calling this enlightened monarchy a tyranny or a despotism was shocking to many observers around the world. Because of this shift in thinking concerning the nature of rights and where they came from, a growing number of colonial leaders felt confident that no reconciliation with the king was possible, and that the colonies then declared their independence in the summer of 1776. Now, there's something, when I taught my classes, I always want to make sure my students understand, because this is often misunderstood. Sometimes we have the perception that the Declaration of Independence caused the war. The war was 9 months old when the Declaration was signed. So the war was already taking place. In July of 1776, 56 representatives gathered at Independence Hall in Philadelphia, one of the two leading cities, that and Boston, in the colonies. This group was known as the Second Continental Congress. In the heat of the Philadelphia summer, this group debated and eventually signed the Declaration, thereby officially separating the colonies from Mother England. This famous document, to which the president of the Continental Congress, John Hancock, affixed his signature in big, bold handwriting so the king could see it, quote, without his spectacles, was written in a specific form as a letter of grievance. The purpose of the document was to demonstrate that George III had become a tyrant and therefore no longer merited the loyalty of his American subjects. In keeping with the legalistic purpose of the letter, the largest part of the document is composed of a list of 28 separate crimes alleged by the colonists against George III and against Parliament. And I want to give you an example of some of these crimes. I'll give you 4. One of the first examples of a crime that's included in the Declaration of Independence is the keeping of standing armies. And if you're going to understand this charge, you have to understand the nature of 18th century warfare. In the 18th century, if a conflict was imminent, an army was raised. There was a draft, right? And men went into the army. They were clothed, they were trained, they were fed, they went off to fight, they came home, and they went back to work. There were no standing armies in the 18th century. What the colonists are claiming is that George III is keeping a standing army in the colonies simply to intimidate them. So they see that as a crime. A second crime that's alleged in the Declaration is the quartering of troops. By virtue of an act called the Quartering Act passed by Parliament, British soldiers had the right to knock on your door as an American colonist and demand food and housing. That was legal. They could also take away your property. If the British soldiers here in the colonies deemed that the new barn that you built was necessary to house the king's horses, they could seize that property. So you can imagine the colonists saw that as a crime. A third example of a crime included in the Declaration is that the king was refusing to answer what were known as petitions. Petitions are letters that are written directly to the king by his subjects, highlighting a grievance and asking for relief. The one who wrote more letters of petition than anybody else was Benjamin Franklin. He was kind of a nuisance. He was writing them to the king constantly. He would allege a crime. He would remind the king that you are our Lord. Part of your duty is to protect us. And the king would dutifully throw that petition in the trash. And he didn't respond to them. So the colonists saw that as a crime. The fourth example I'd give you is one we've already talked about, and that is the change in taxation. Instead of allowing the colonists to continue paying their taxes to their colonial capital, the king, trying to erase the debt of the 7 Years' War, said, no, you're going to pay your taxes to me directly. And the colonists said, that's a crime. Now, as to the writing of the Declaration itself, there's a 5-man writing committee. You're going to recognize the first 3 names for sure. Those are Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Ben Franklin. Lesser known on that committee are Robert Livingston and a guy by the name of Roger Sherman. You'll hear more about Roger Sherman later. He's a fascinating man. The document was constructed, however, largely by Jefferson. The way things happened is they would meet during the day. The 56 gentlemen would meet in Independence Hall. They would have discussion. There would be speeches. People would take notes. And then in the evening, they would drink beer. They would go to the taverns. They would take notes with him. They would discuss what they did. Jefferson would compile all those notes. He would stay up later than everybody else, and he would work on a single draft. It was infuriating to Jefferson because they'd come back the next day, and like teachers, right, people would mark up what Jefferson had written, and Jefferson had a pretty good-sized ego. He didn't like to be criticized. Now, at this time, when Jefferson is creating the Declaration, he's just 33 years of age. And he's an unlikely choice to be the one that does the bulk of the writing because he doesn't talk. And when I say he doesn't talk, he literally did not speak a word during the Second Continental Congress. There are very copious notes taken. And at no time does Mr. Jefferson's name show up in those notes. Jefferson sat in a corner and doodled and took notes. But the reason he was chosen by his colleagues is that Jefferson had a classical education. And as a result, they believed him most able to set down their ideas in a document in a style that anyone could read. His peers chose Jefferson because they wanted their ideas to be accessible to the world. This is a key point. It's something that separates the American founding from that of any other nation. The signers of the Declaration saw their cause as universal in nature. In their view, the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness were not just American rights, but universal rights given to every man by his Creator. This is truly, truly revolutionary. Because the founders viewed their cause as universal, and because they knew they would need the assistance in fighting the mightiest army and navy in the world, they sent copies of the Declaration all over the colonies and to all corners of the earth. John Hancock was tasked with doing this. He ordered a Philadelphia publisher to print 500 copies, one to be read out in every town and village across the colonies. The Declaration's effect on the spirit of the American people was described as electrifying. Parades, celebrations, fireworks, 13-gun salutes, and toasts were typically accompanied by a public reading. The Declaration provided a rallying cry for George Washington and his listless army. On July 9th, 1776, Washington ordered the army in New York to convene in Lower Manhattan to hear one of the first ever public readings of the Declaration. Now, one of the things that strikes me most deeply about the writing of the Declaration is the courage of the 56 men who actually affixed their signature to the finished document. I appreciate the courage it took them to do that because at the time the Declaration was signed, independence was anything but a foregone conclusion. Remember, we said the war was 9 months old. They hadn't won anything in those 9 months. Since Lexington and Concord, the Continental Army had not fared well against the British, and it was literally struggling to survive. Nevertheless, Jefferson and the other signers made a decision, despite knowing the moment they did it, that they would be considered traitors to the king and that they would be targets of the British Army in America. Many anecdotes about the courage of the signers have come down to us about that summer. But one of my favorites is a story involving a very strange pair of friends, Benjamin Harrison of Virginia and Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts. If you wonder where the term gerrymandering comes from, it's Elbridge Gerry. Benjamin Harrison was an unusually large man for the 18th century. He was over 6 feet tall, well over 300 pounds, and he had a big, booming voice. Elbridge Gerry was the opposite. He was barely 5 feet tall, just over 120 pounds. And as the two of them were waiting their turn to sign the Declaration, they were discussing their likely fate. They were discussing what it was going to be like to be hanged. Benjamin Harrison, in his big booming voice, loud enough for everybody in the room to hear him, said, "With me, it'll be over just like that." And he snapped his fingers. "Because of my weight, my size, I'll die right away." He then paused and looked at the smaller Elbridge Gerry. He said, "With you, my little friend, you'll be dancing on air an hour after I'm gone." Imagine the courage it took to joke like that when you're committing your name to treason. The humor of the story has an impact because of the timing. These men knew exactly what their fate would be if they put their names on the declaration. They realized the gravity of their situation. They knew that they would be hunted men, that they would likely die at the hands of the British. Still, in the closing line of the declaration, these 56 men, our founders, pledged not only to each other, but to all of posterity, to us as well, their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. Even before the list was published, the British marked down the names of every member of Congress suspected of having signed the declaration. All of them became objects of vicious manhunts. Some of them were taken. Some, like Jefferson, had narrow escapes. All who had property or families near British strongholds suffered. All of the signers suffered in some way. But I want to finish by highlighting the story of just 4 men that I think well represents the bravery that these men showed. Francis Lewis, a delegate of New York, saw his home plundered and his estates in what is now Harlem completely destroyed by British soldiers. Mrs. Lewis, his wife, was captured and treated by the British with great brutality. Though she was later exchanged for 2 British prisoners through the efforts of Congress, she died from the effects of her abuse. So Francis Lewis gave his wife. John Hart, delegate of New Jersey, risked his life to return home when he received a message just before the end of the summer that his wife was very ill and that she was likely to die. When he was nearly at home, Hessian soldiers, these are the German mercenaries that the British hired to fight alongside them here in the colonies, Hessian soldiers rode after him and he escaped into the woods. While his wife lay on her deathbed, the Hessians ruined his farm and wrecked his homestead. For the next several months, the 68-year-old Hart slept in caves and in the woods as he was hunted across the countryside. When at long last, emaciated by his hardship, he was able to return home, he found that his wife had been buried and the 13 members of his family that lived right there had been scattered. Some were sent to England. None of them he ever saw again. He died a broken man in 1779 without ever finding a single member of his family. Thomas Nelson, the former governor of Virginia, was at the front in command of troops at the Battle of Yorktown, the last major battle of the war. During the Battle of Yorktown, British General Cornwallis and his staff moved their headquarters into Nelson's former home he had built with his own hands. Nelson found himself up on a ridge looking down at his former home, and there were British officers on the porch and in the house. And while American cannonballs were making a shambles of the town around that house, Nelson's house wasn't struck. As the day wore on, Nelson turned in rage to the American gunners, and he demanded, "Why do you spare my home?" And they said, "Sir, out of respect for you." Nelson said, "Give me the cannon." And he fired on his magnificent home himself, smashing it to bits. Nelson's sacrifice wasn't quite yet over. During the course of the war, he had raised $2 million for the revolutionary cause by pledging his own land. When the loans came due, a newer peacetime Congress refused to honor them, and Nelson's property was forfeited. He was never reimbursed, and he died impoverished a few years later at the age of 50. Lastly, Abraham Clark, the gentleman whose name I mentioned at the beginning of our evening. My answer to the question, why does 250 matter? During the war, Abraham Clark gave 2 sons to the officer corps of the Continental Army. They were both captured and sent to the infamous British prison ship, the Jersey. You see, during the war, the British didn't build prisons for those they captured. They sent them to prison ships off the East Coast. The Jersey was the worst of these ships. It was known in the colonies as the hell ship because of the conditions experienced by the men who were imprisoned there. There were poor rations and unclean water. There was a lack of medical care and filthy conditions that led to rampant disease. Because their father had signed the declaration, the younger Clarks were treated with a special brutality. Just 2 weeks before the end of the war, the British got a message to Abraham Clark, and they told him if he would come out against the Declaration, if he would come out against the war, against George Washington, if he would come out in favor of king and of country, they would release his sons. And Abraham Clark's answer was no. And both of his sons died on the Jersey just 2 weeks short of the end of the war. That's my answer to why 250 matters. Thank you. We're done. All right, I'm pretty good on time. We said 60 to 75 minutes. We're at 65. We've got a few minutes for questions if folks have questions about anything. I know we covered a bunch of material, Hebrews, Greeks, Romans, British colonies, Declaration. Are there questions about anything that I can answer for anybody? Yes, there is more watermelon in the back. Run. Sir. Sadly, few. Yeah, there are a couple that really take an interest in this history. There is an innate respect for the founding of the nation amongst most of the members, but there's not a knowledge of the history amongst most of the members. I can only think of one other member who probably could stand up and do this, right? That knows the history. Yeah, we talk an awful lot about obviously how to fix problems, how to deal with issues, and I find myself going back to a lot of the things that I know about the founders and know about history. And I share those arguments. I'm not sure others would know exactly where those arguments came from. In fact, some of them make those arguments because it's something they were taught in school or they've learned just as being part of the culture. You know, there's a cultural momentum that exists in every society. And I think that's one of the things that's wrong with America right now is we're losing that cultural momentum. As generations pass, generations that have failed to pass these stories down to their kids, that cultural momentum is disappearing. And it's harder and harder for us to do things instinctively. Right, so I think it's really important that we actively go out and learn this history. We actively go out and learn the stories because it's not just there in the air anymore the way it used to be. Yeah. What else? Good questions, Rodney. You're a good plant. Latrell. Yeah. Historians estimate that about a third of the people living in the British colonies were loyal to the king. They said about a third were loyal to the revolution, about a third were loyal to the king, and about a third just didn't want to be bothered. They didn't care who won. They just wanted life to go on. The loyalists, in many cases, went either to the city of New York, that was a loyalist stronghold, or they went north to Canada. So as we look north to Canada today, those are the guys who were the traitors during the Revolution, right? They went up north to an area that was still controlled strongly by the British. Was there something specific? Yeah, absolutely. There were people that thought it was unholy of John Adams and George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, that they were not just turning against the king, they were turning against God, because who chose the king? God, right? So there were certainly those among the loyalists who had a religious opposition to the revolution. There were likewise among the revolutionaries those who pointed to God and said, well, he's the reason that we're doing this, right? So we had people on both sides pointing to God and saying, we're doing the right thing. Yeah. Good question. Yeah, absolutely. But look at the Civil War, right? You have some devout people on both sides pointing to Scripture saying we're the ones in the right, right? We're doing what God is calling us to do. So, what else? You ask as many as you want, Rodney. It's a free event. Yeah.
And for a number of years, he has made a statement that when a generation starts looking back at history, you see in his line of work, which is a lot of travel and education, a lot more higher level interest in that. Proof of us being here today.
Yeah.
He said that is actually evidence that we are in another season of revival.
Yeah.
Maybe like the first or second Great Awakening.
Yeah.
Appreciate your referencing to that. There's also that sense of, during the Great Awakening, innovation always followed those Great Awakenings. So France, looking at America, saying, how can they be so accelerated in their growth? Perhaps that's connected that, their God-fearing, innovative, creative minds, followed the awakening.
Right. You and I have talked about this before. I really think there is an awakening going on in the United States. If you look at any of the questions that are asked to young people, the polling, there's a real interest in American history. And I think that's largely our fault, right? Our generations represented here this evening didn't show that same interest. And people younger than us are saying, how come I didn't know that, right? When I tell those stories that I just finished with, the reaction generally is anger, that we don't know those stories. How dare they didn't tell us that in school? How dare we weren't taught that, right? There's a genuine anger amongst folks. But I think that's where a lot of young people are, right? They, as Gordy said, this is the greatest country in the world, the greatest country in the history of the world. And young people are frustrated that they haven't been taught why, right? They sense that, they know that. If they travel overseas at all, it's confirmed for them. When I first went overseas, I went to France, and God, I wanted to be back in America as quickly as possible. I went to China, that was even worse, right? But there's this sense, people recognize there's really something special about this, but they don't quite know why. So I think we're in this period, in this season of trying to figure that out, right? We're learning these stories. We're learning this history. What is the foundation? Why are we so special? I think that process is going on tonight, but all over the country. Yeah. What else? Ben. Hmm. In the societies that preceded us, right, all the way back to the Hebrews and the Greeks and the Romans, there was always something bigger than self. Right, for the Romans, it was Rome, right? That one word encapsulated so many things. For the Greeks, it was their individual city-state. Right, for other peoples in history, it was something else. But it was always about something bigger than self. In the 1960s, America lost that view, right? In the 1960s, America became preoccupied with self. And I think we're still there in many, many ways. So we see today everything through the prism of how does this affect me? Is this going to promote my individual happiness? Not is it good for society? Is it good for the whole? Is it good for America? Right? It's how does it affect me? So that's one of the negatives that I think we're battling, right? Both in the church and in the public square as well. Does that help? Yeah. Okay. What else? Some of you are giving me quizzical looks. Oh boy. Ben, you want to come up front? Many of you in the room know that my background is education. I met Ben. He hired me to work at Washington State, and then I hired him to work at Veritas. Our education system is broken in the United States, and it's broken in so many different ways. If any of you follow me on Facebook, Rebecca, I know you do. I posted something, I think it was 2 days ago, Roger, you do, on my view of education. If you want to read that, friend me on Facebook, and you can go back. It was 2 days ago. When I talk that way in Columbus, people look at me like I'm an alien from another planet. Right? The focus in Columbus, the belief in Columbus is the only reason we go to school is to get a job. That's it. There's nothing above that purpose right there. One of the reasons that Ben and I started Veritas, the private school up on the hill, is because we had an older view of education. The purpose of education is the acquisition of wisdom and virtue, right? You get a job as a secondary benefit of education, not a primary benefit. You chase wisdom and virtue, you get a job, right? But again, if I speak that way in Columbus, it's an uphill battle. I'm there because I'm up for that uphill battle, but it's a battle. There are not many people that understand education the same way that I do up there. So yes, we have to fix our education system. If you got 3 or 4 days, I'll explain to you how I think we should do that. Yeah. Any last comment? I want to respect your time, so I don't want to keep you too long, but is there any last comment? Gordy?
I just wanted to let everyone know we did stream this tonight, so if you go to Facebook or YouTube, you can search Celebration Center Mary Evan, it should come up, and you'll find it on either of those platforms.
Thank you for doing that very much. Many of my colleagues that are intrigued by these kinds of ideas always say, are you going to tape that? Are you going to video that? And usually the answer is no. So I tell them, you got to come down to Southeast Ohio. We're nice people. You know, we'll treat you well. If you would, give Gordy another round of applause for the use of his church. Remember, we will meet 1 week from tonight at 7 o'clock. I told you what we're going to talk about. I forgot what that was. Hopefully you remember. I will be here, so hopefully we'll see you then. Thanks so much. Have a good evening.